The wind howled through the towering pines, shaking snow from their heavy branches, as the man trudged up the mountain trail. He carried firewood strapped to his back and a satchel full of supplies. It had been a harsh winter, with relentless storms that left the world outside his cabin buried under feet of snow. Yet the solitude of the mountains was what he had sought when he moved here. The cabin was nestled at the edge of a frozen lake, the perfect retreat from a world he no longer felt a part of. When he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the fire greeted him. It was a relief, but something else caught his attention. It was the faintest sound, a rustle, barely perceptible. He paused, his breath clouding in the air as he listened. His heart quickened. He wasn't alone. He turned toward the shadows in the corner of the room, where the firelight didn't reach. There was movement, subtle, graceful, and almost imperceptible. And then she stepped into view. The first time he had seen her, she had seemed like a mirage. Tall, slender, with skin that shimmered faintly like the moonlight on snow. Her eyes were unlike anything he had ever encountered. Large, luminous, and filled with the weight of 1,000 stories. She moved with an elegance that made her seem otherworldly, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. She didn't speak his language, but she had made her intentions clear from the beginning. She was hiding. From what or whom, she never said, and he never pressed. He called her the Huntress in his mind, for it was clear from her demeanor and the bow slung across her back that she was no stranger to survival. She was careful to keep her distance, observing him from the shadows while he went about his routines. Over time, they developed an unspoken understanding. He left food for her by the fire, and she accepted it with a nod of gratitude. She never stayed in the open long, always retreating to her corner of the cabin, where she seemed to disappear into the darkness. Days turned into weeks, and the man found himself growing accustomed to her presence. He wondered about her, where she had come from, why she was here, and what she feared. But the answers remained elusive, locked behind those inscrutable eyes. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, he noticed something unusual. Her gaze was fixed on the window, her body tense. She was listening, her head tilted slightly, as if catching a sound he couldn't hear. Her hand moved instinctively to the hilt of a blade at her side. "Is someone out there?" he asked, though he knew she wouldn't respond. She glanced at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. The Huntress didn't answer, but her gaze remained locked on the window. The man felt a chill that had nothing to do with the freezing wind outside. He moved toward the window, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. Peering out into the swirling snow, he saw nothing but the chaotic dance of white and shadow. "What is it?" he asked again, his voice low, almost a whisper. She remained silent, but her hand never left the hilt of her blade. Her posture was rigid, every muscle taut as if preparing for an ambush. The man had seen animals behave like this in the forest, watchful, wary, sensing danger long before it became visible. The storm outside howled louder, the wind slamming against the cabin walls. He moved away from the window, uneasy now. The Huntress stayed by the shadows, her luminous eyes darting to every corner of the room as if expecting something to burst through the door. The silence between them stretched until it was almost unbearable. Then, without warning, she stepped forward. Her movements were swift and decisive, her cloak brushing against the floor as she approached him. She reached out, gripping his arm with a strength that surprised him. "Stay," she said, her voice soft but commanding. It was the first word she had ever spoken to him. Before he could respond, she let go of his arm and slipped to the door. She moved so quickly and silently that she seemed to vanish into the storm as soon as she opened it. The wind rushed in, biting and frigid, before the door slammed shut again behind her. The man stood there, stunned. He had no idea what she had meant or what she was doing, but his instincts screamed at him to trust her warning. He turned toward the fire, stoking it until the flames roared, the warmth pushing back the creeping chill that filled the room. Minutes dragged into hours, and she didn't return. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the man's worry grew. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. He barely knew her, and she clearly wanted it that way. Yet something about her presence had become vital, like the firelight that kept the dark at bay. When the door finally creaked open again, he jumped to his feet. She stumbled inside, snow clinging to her hair and cloak. Blood streaked her arm, stark against her pale skin. She held a blade in her hand, its edge glinting faintly with something dark and viscous. "What happened?" he asked, rushing to her side. She didn't answer, collapsing onto her knees. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. He knelt beside her, carefully taking her injured arm in his hands. The wound was deep but clean, a gash along her forearm, as if from a sharp claw or blade. He grabbed a cloth and pressed it against the wound, ignoring her sharp intake of breath. "Who's out there?" he demanded, though he doubted she would answer. "Are they coming here?" To his surprise, she looked at him, her gaze steady despite the pain. "Not now," she said, her voice rough but clear. "I stopped them." "Stopped who?" he pressed. Her lips tightened, and she shook her head. "Danger. Always." That was all she would say before exhaustion overtook her. He helped her to the corner where she always hid, arranging the blankets around her as she drifted into uneasy sleep. Her bow and blade remained clutched in her hands, even as her body slackened. The man sat by the fire, watching over her as the storm raged outside. Questions swirled in his mind, unanswered and unanswerable. But one thing was certain, whatever had pursued her to his mountain, it wasn't finished. And neither, he realized, was she. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world outside buried under fresh layers of snow. The man awoke in his chair by the fire, the embers glowing faintly in the hearth. His neck ached from sleeping upright, but his discomfort was secondary to the worry that still gnawed at him. He glanced toward the corner where she had fallen asleep. She was gone. Panic surged, but before he could move, the door creaked open. She stepped inside, her movements deliberate, her expression unreadable. Her arm was still bound with the cloth he had used, though it bore faint traces of her blood. She carried something with her, a small bundle wrapped in a strange shimmering material that seemed to refract the weak morning light. She placed the bundle on the table without a word. He hesitated, then moved closer, his curiosity outweighing his apprehension. Slowly, she unfolded the covering, revealing the contents within. The object inside made him recoil. It was a weapon, unlike anything he had ever seen. Its design was sleek and alien, with smooth curves and glowing symbols etched into its surface. The craftsmanship was otherworldly, almost alive in the way the light danced across it. "What is that?" he asked, though he doubted she would explain. "Proof," she said simply. "Proof of what?" She met his gaze, her expression grave. "They know." His pulse quickened. "Who knows?" "The people you're hiding from." She nodded. "Not people," she corrected. "Hunters." The word sent a chill down his spine. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but the weight of it was undeniable. Her enemies, whoever or whatever they were, had found her. And by extension, they had found him. "What do they want?" he asked. She hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she said, "Me. My kind. We do not belong here." The admission raised more questions than it answered, but her tone left no room for further inquiry. Instead, he focused on the practical. "What do we do?" She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her otherwise composed expression. It was as if she hadn't expected him to involve himself. "Stay safe. Stay hidden." He shook his head. "That's not enough. If they're coming here, we need to be ready." For the first time, she smiled, a small, fleeting expression that softened her sharp features. "Brave," she said, almost to herself. Then, more seriously, "but foolish." Despite her warning, he spent the day preparing. He gathered supplies, fortified the cabin's walls and windows, and made a plan for defense. She watched him silently, occasionally offering a nod of approval or a quiet suggestion. He realized that, despite her reluctance to explain, she respected his determination. That night, she showed him how to use the weapon she had brought. Its mechanisms were complex, far beyond anything he had encountered before, but she was a patient teacher. As she guided his hands, he noticed the way her demeanor shifted, calm, focused, and entirely in her element. For the first time, He saw her not as a mysterious figure hiding in his cabin, but as a warrior. The attack came 3 nights later. It began with a low hum that seemed to emanate from the forest, vibrating through the air like an unnatural pulse. He and the Huntress were ready, their preparations complete. She stood by the window, her bow in hand, while he crouched by the fire, clutching the alien weapon she had entrusted to him. The first figure emerged from the tree lean, its silhouette barely visible against the snow. It wasn't human. Its body was angular and insectoid, with limbs that moved unnaturally, as though it was unaccustomed to the terrain. More followed, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. She loosed an arrow, the projectile streaking through the air with unerring precision. The creature fell, its body crumpling into the snow. The others hesitated, then surged forward, their movements suddenly faster, more aggressive. The man fired the weapon. It roared to life, a beam of energy lancing out and striking one of the creatures. The recoil nearly knocked him over, but the result was immediate. The creature disintegrated, its form dissolving into ash. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The creatures were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. But the Huntress fought with a skill and ferocity that seemed almost otherworldly, her movements fluid and precise. She was a blur of motion, her arrows striking true, her blade flashing in the firelight. The man held his ground, firing the weapon whenever a creature came too close. His fear was a constant presence, but so was his determination. This was his home, and he wouldn't let these invaders take it. When the last of the creatures fell, the silence was deafening. The man stood in the center of the cabin, the alien weapon still clutched in his hands. The Huntress stood by the door, her breathing heavy, her bow lowered. "It's over," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. She shook her head. No. This was only the beginning. He didn't argue. Instead, he moved to the fire, stoking the flames once more. She joined him, her expression weary but resolute. "They'll come again," she said. "Stronger. In greater numbers." "Then we'll be ready," he replied. For the first time, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire. Together, they sat in silence, the warmth of the flames pushing back the cold of the night. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. And neither of them was alone anymore. The days that followed were marked by a heavy stillness, a kind of uneasy calm that settled over the cabin. The snow outside lay undisturbed, but the man and the Huntress both knew it was only a matter of time before the next wave arrived. He busied himself with repairs. The windows that had been cracked during the battle were reinforced with thick wooden planks. He crafted makeshift barricades for the doors and laid traps around the perimeter of the cabin. She worked beside him, her movements precise and efficient. Despite her injuries, she showed no signs of slowing. They didn't speak much. Communication between them had always been sparse, but now it felt unnecessary. A kind of understanding had formed between them, born of shared survival and mutual respect. He no longer questioned her presence, and she no longer hesitated to involve him in her preparations. One night, as they sat by the fire, she finally broke the silence. "You're different," she said, her voice soft but certain. He glanced at her, surprised. "Different how?" She stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. "Most would run. Hide. Not you." He shrugged, unsure of how to respond. "This is my home. I can't just leave it." She nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "You have strength," she said. "But strength is not enough. They will test you." "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are they after you?" She hesitated, her gaze shifting to the window. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "My kind, we fled. From them. From their rule. We wanted peace." "Your kind," he prompted gently. "You mean?" "Not human," she said, cutting him off. "We are different. But we mean no harm." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. He had suspected as much, but hearing her confirm it felt surreal. "Why come here?" he asked. "To this world." "It was hidden," she replied. "Safe." Until now. He frowned. And now they've found you. She nodded. Because of me. Her admission carried a weight of guilt that he could see in her eyes. Before he could respond, she stood and moved to the window, her gaze scanning the forest outside. They won't stop, she said. Not until they have us all. The next attack came at dawn. This time, the hum was louder, deeper, vibrating through the earth like a warning bell. The man and the huntress were already awake, their weapons ready. The traps he had laid around the cabin were their first line of defense, but he doubted they would hold for long. The creatures came in greater numbers, their forms shifting and indistinct in the early light. Some moved on 2 legs, others on 4, their bodies twisted and grotesque. They were faster this time, more coordinated, as if they had learned from their previous defeat. The first trap was triggered near the tree lean, a sharp snap of metal followed by an inhuman screech. The huntress notched an arrow and loosed it, the projectile finding its mark in the chest of a charging creature. It fell, but 2 more took its place. The man fired the alien weapon, the beam of energy cutting through the creatures with deadly precision. His aim was improving, thanks to her training, but the sheer number of enemies made it nearly impossible to keep up. They're testing us, she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. Finding our weaknesses. Then we don't give them any, he replied, his grip tightening on the weapon. The battle was relentless. The creatures swarmed the cabin, their claws tearing at the walls, their shrieks echoing through the air. The traps slowed them, but they kept coming, their determination unwavering. The huntress fought like a force of nature, her arrows flying faster than he could track. When her quiver was empty, she drew her blade, its edge gleaming in the pale light. She moved with a grace and ferocity that left him in awe, cutting down the creatures with fluid precision. But even she couldn't hold them all back. One of the creatures broke through the barricade, its form looming in the doorway. The man turned and fired, the blast striking it in the chest and sending it sprawling to the ground. "They're inside," he shouted. She whirled, her blade flashing as she took down another creature. "Hold the line," she called, her voice fierce and commanding. They fought side by side, their movements synchronized despite their differences. The man had never felt anything like it, a connection born not of words but of action, of survival. They were a team, and together, they held the creatures at bay. When the last of the attackers fell, the cabin was in ruins. The barricades were shattered, the walls scarred with claw marks. The man leaned against the table, his chest heaving, while the huntress stood by the door, her blade dripping with black ichor. "It's not over," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "They'll come again." He nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Then we'll be ready." She turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "You have fought well," she said. "Better than I expected." "Thanks," he said, managing a weak smile. "But I couldn't have done it without you." For the first time, her expression softened. "Together," she said, "we stand a chance." The days that followed were a blur of preparation and recovery. The cabin, though battered, still stood, and the man was determined to fortify it further. He scavenged what materials he could from the surrounding woods, building stronger barriers and setting more sophisticated traps under the huntress's guidance. She had an uncanny ability to anticipate how the creatures would attack, her instincts honed from years of evading her pursuers. At night, they spoke in quiet tones by the fire. Though she was still guarded, she began to reveal fragments of her past. Her people, she explained, were once explorers, travelers who roamed the stars in search of knowledge and harmony. They had no desire for conquest, only coexistence. But they had encountered a force that saw their pacifism as weakness, a relentless, expansionist empire that sought to dominate every world it touched. "They call themselves the Dominion," she said one evening, her voice tinged with bitterness. "To them, we were prey. Useful only as tools or trophies." "Is that why you fled here?" he asked. She nodded. "Some of us escaped. We scattered, hoping to disappear among the stars. I came here, to this world, because it was hidden. Quiet. I thought I would be safe." Her gaze dropped to the fire, the flickering light casting shadows across her face. "But I led them here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And now they won't stop until they've taken everything. You didn't lead them, he said firmly. They would have found this place eventually. And now we're fighting back. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of her guilt seemed to lift. She gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of his words. The next attack came sooner than either of them had anticipated. It began with a sound that was different from the low hum of before, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the sky itself. The man stepped outside, his breath freezing in the air as he scanned the horizon. "What is it?" he called back into the cabin. The Huntress emerged, her expression grim. "A ship." He followed her gaze and saw it, a dark, angular silhouette descending through the clouds, its underside glowing with a faint, malevolent light. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakably alien, its presence a stark violation of the serene mountain landscape. "They've sent a scout," she said, her voice tight, "to assess the threat." "And if they decide we're a threat?" he asked. "They'll send more," she replied. "Much more." They had no choice but to fight. The Huntress moved quickly, gathering her weapons and instructing him on how to use the alien device she had given him more effectively. She showed him weak points to aim for, strategies to draw the enemy into their traps. When the ship landed in a clearing not far from the cabin, the creatures emerged. These were different from the ones they had faced before, larger, more armored, with weapons that glowed faintly in the dim light. They moved with a purpose that was unsettling, their eyes scanning the landscape as if calculating every move. The battle was brutal. The man and the Huntress fought with everything they had, using the traps and the terrain to their advantage. The creatures were strong, but they were not invincible. The Huntress's arrows struck with deadly precision, and the man's weapon tore through their ranks. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. For every creature they felled, another seemed to take its place. The fight pushed them back to the cabin, where they made their final stand. The man's arms ached from firing the weapon, and the Huntress's quiver was nearly empty. Just when it seemed the battle would be lost, the ship itself began to hum, its lights pulsing in an ominous rhythm. The Huntress froze, her eyes widening. "They're calling reinforcements." The man's heart sank. "What do we do?" Her gaze shifted to the weapon in his hands. "The core," she said. "If we can destroy the ship's core, it will stop the signal." "Where is it?" he asked. She pointed toward the clearing. "Inside. But it's heavily guarded." He looked at her, then at the cabin. It was clear the defenses wouldn't hold much longer. "We don't have a choice, do we?" "No," she said, her voice steady. "We don't." The assault on the ship was a desperate gamble. The Huntress led the way, her movements swift and silent, while the man followed, clutching the alien weapon tightly. The creatures guarding the ship were formidable, but they fought with a ferocity born of necessity. Inside the ship, the air was thick and oppressive, the walls lined with glowing symbols that seemed to pulse in time with the hum of the core. The Huntress moved with purpose, guiding him toward the heart of the vessel. When they reached the core, it was as she had described, a massive, pulsating sphere of energy, its surface alive with shifting light. The room was heavily guarded, but the Huntress didn't hesitate. She charged forward, her blade cutting through the enemy with precision and fury. The man fired the weapon, its blasts tearing through the creatures as they closed in. The core pulsed brighter, its hum growing louder, as if aware of their presence. "Now!" she shouted. "Destroy it!" He aimed the weapon at the core and fired. The blast struck true, the energy from the weapon colliding with the core in a brilliant explosion of light and sound. The ship shuddered, its walls cracking as the core imploded. The creatures fell, their bodies crumpling as if their lifeline had been severed. The Huntress grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. "Run!" They barely made it out before the ship collapsed in on itself, a blinding flash of light consuming it. The shock wave knocked them to the ground, the forest trembling under the force of the explosion. When the dust settled, the ship was gone, reduced to nothing but smoldering wreckage. The man and the Huntress lay side by side in the snow, their breaths ragged, their bodies battered but alive. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "For now," she replied, her gaze fixed on the stars. "But they'll come again." He turned to her, his determination unshaken. Then we'll be ready. The days following the destruction of the ship were quiet. Too quiet. The man and the Huntress worked tirelessly to repair the cabin and reinforce their defenses, but there were no signs of further attacks. The forest, once alive with the hum of alien technology and the screeches of predators, returned to its natural stillness. Though they remained vigilant, the man couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The Huntress seemed more relaxed, her usual tension giving way to moments of introspection. She often gazed at the horizon, her sharp eyes scanning the sky as if waiting for something. "Do you think they're coming back?" he asked one evening as they sat by the fire. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her blade. "I don't know," she admitted. "The Dominion is relentless. But this was a costly loss for them. They won't act rashly." Her words offered little comfort, but her tone carried a hint of hope. For the first time, she didn't seem certain that the fight was inevitable. Weeks turned into months, and winter began to wane. The heavy snows gave way to the first signs of spring, melting icicles, budding trees, and the sound of running water as the streams thawed. Life returned to the forest, and with it, a sense of renewal. The man and the Huntress had grown closer in that time, their bond forged in the crucible of survival. She shared more of her past, her people, and the life she had left behind. He shared his own stories, memories of a simpler time before his solitude, of the family he had lost and the reasons he had chosen the mountains as his refuge. "You've sacrificed a lot," she said one evening, her voice soft. "For someone you barely know." He smiled, a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Maybe. But I don't regret it." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, for the first time, she reached out and placed a hand on his. "Neither do I." One morning, as the man was chopping wood, the Huntress appeared at his side, her eyes bright with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "They're here," she said, her voice calm but urgent. He froze, his heart sinking. "The Dominion?" She shook her head. "Not them. My people." He followed her gaze to the sky, where a sleek, silver craft was descending. It was smaller than the Dominion ship, its design elegant and peaceful. The sight filled him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. When the craft landed in the clearing, two figures emerged. They were like her, tall, graceful, with features that seemed almost otherworldly. Their movements were cautious, but their faces showed no hostility. Instead, they radiated a quiet sense of relief. The Huntress stepped forward, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The two figures responded, their voices melodic and soothing. Though he couldn't comprehend their words, he understood the emotion behind them: gratitude, reunion, and a promise of safety. After a long exchange, she turned to him, her expression bittersweet. "They've come to take me home." His stomach tightened. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it hit harder than he expected. "Home," he echoed. "Is it safe for you there?" She nodded. "Safer than here. They've found a place where the Dominion cannot follow. A sanctuary." He looked at her, struggling to find the right words. "You deserve that," he said finally. "A place where you can live in peace." She stepped closer, her gaze softening. "And you? Will you be all right?" He managed a smile, though his heart ached. "I've been alone before. I'll manage." Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment, she seemed to hesitate. Then she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, glowing device. "Take this," she said, pressing it into his hand. "If you ever need help, use it. It will send a signal to us." He looked at the device, then back at her. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She stepped back, her movements deliberate, as if every step away from him was a struggle. The two figures from the craft waited patiently, their eyes full of understanding. As she reached the ship's entrance, she turned one last time. "You're stronger than you know," she said, "and braver than anyone I've ever met." He watched as she disappeared into the craft, the door closing behind her. The ship rose gracefully into the sky, its engines humming softly. Within moments, it was gone, leaving him alone once more. Spring fully arrived, and life in the mountains continued. The man resumed his routines, his days filled with chopping wood, fishing, and tending to the cabin. But it wasn't the same. The Huntress had left her mark, not just on the cabin or the forest, but on him. Though he missed her, he took comfort in knowing she was safe. And when he looked at the device she had given him, tucked carefully on the mantelpiece, he felt a quiet sense of hope. Because somewhere out there, among the stars, he had an ally. A friend. And perhaps one day, he would see her again. For now, he was content to wait.